Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Velina Tchakarova. Velina is the director at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, Austria. Her work includes research, consulting, and lectures on global system transformation and the geostrategy of global actors, particularly the EU's role in Eastern Europe. If you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Velina, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure being with you.
We spoke with you back in episode 50, recorded in September of 2021. So why don't you give us a brief update on what you've been up to?
Okay, so what we discussed during the first episode was basically my view on the current global system transformation, right, and how I look at these transformational processes and try to make sense of them. And the way how I anticipated certain systemic shifts and changes was basically centered around several ideas which I derived from actually from strategic foresight and trends analysis. And the one trend that I've been carefully looking at for at least the last, let's say 10, 12 years, is the trend of bifurcation of the global system, namely a process where in all relevant socio-economic networks, there is a kind of a bipolarization of the network. That would mean the emergence of two centers of power. The one, of course, being centered around United States, which is still the only state actor with global power projections, undoubtedly, even now in 2022. However, there is meanwhile a second center of power, a regional one, which is now being centered around China. And of course, the open question is whether this center of power is going to transfer its geoeconomic cloud and also growing geopolitical cloud into a global power projection. This is a question mark. The trend points to the bifurcation, but it does not necessarily have to end up with this scenario. We may also witness a kind of a unilateral period of the international relations, basically not the same as following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but a similar period dominated by, once again, American global power projection. We may end up also in a scenario where there will be regional centers of power. For instance, given that Russia is currently in a full-scale war against a sovereign country, and depending on the outcome of this war, Russia may end up with, with not the outcome that Moscow has been anticipating. So in a sense, may erase itself from the current global power equilibrium. So a lot of question marks. This was the one thing, the bifurcation of the global system. The second, of course, is that due to this bifurcation, we have a lot of size powers in the world, in all relevant continents, where basically regional actors are mostly interested in avoiding taking sides, because by navigating between these two centers of power, they can actually capitalize on or maximize, let's say, gains from the relations with both United States and China. And there are many examples of such regional actors. Specifically, if you look at the European continent, you will find that the European Union, which is a strategic partner of United States on the one hand, but has been actually deepening relations with China, basically expanding the geo-economic relationship with China, while not looking at China as a potential security threat. At the same time, of course, some countries, meanwhile, and we've actually observed such examples. Here, of course, my main thesis is that at some point of time, given the acceleration of the global systemic processes, we may end up with a scenario where these regional actors will be confronted with either or choice. And for instance, if you look at what Australia actually decided to do, namely to enter a security and defense pact with the United States and with Great Britain, the so-called AUKUS, this was a clear decision against its geo-economic ties with China, which at that point of time were quite relevant and significant. So in a sense, I think that we will observe more such examples. And right now, I also argue that the decision by Moscow to enter this war, to actually launch a full-scale war, has entailed this layer, this additional layer of calculation, which is in fact the realization that Russia needs to upgrade its positioning in the long game. That is going to be the systemic competition between United States and China. And in doing so, basically, Russia sided with China. And I even argued that the Russian president would have never taken the decision on a full-scale war against Ukraine on the 24th of February if he had not relied on the overt and explicit financial, economic, and trade support by China in the aftermath. And I will stop here for more questions.
So you covered a lot of ground there. I remember that conversation. That's episode 50. If anyone in the audience hasn't heard it and wants to go back and listen to it, it was fascinating. I obviously wanted to speak with you because of the unfolding aggression perpetrated by Russia against the Ukraine. And I wanted to back up first and ask you a foundational question, and that is related to Vladimir Putin's motives here. So you said that he would not have proceeded with this if he didn't have the explicit economic and financial assurances of China. And there's been a lot of speculation about what exactly is going on inside of his head. You've got John Mearsheimer, who says that it's driven entirely by concerns over NATO expansion. We interviewed Samo Buria a little bit back, and he said that he thinks that actually what Vladimir Putin is trying to do is establish kind of a new Russian state, not hearkening back to the Soviet Union, but something even older than that, and reconceptualizing the legitimacy of the Russian state. Where do you come down on that? Like, what do you think he's hoping to get out of this?
In my personal view, Russia's plans to make a move on Ukraine have entailed three specific dimensions right from the start. There was no doubt to my mind that the ultimate goal of Russia has always been the subjugation of Ukraine. However, I anticipated this process in several stages. So, in fact, when the military escalation began at the end of November, beginning of December, there was no doubt, at least in my anticipation, that we would witness a military attack, a direct military attack by Russia against Ukraine at some point of time. And I argued in December that this would definitely be after the Olympic Games on February 20. However, I belong to the majority of experts who basically, were wrong on the scale of this military attack, because it was not a military attack. I anticipated a limited operation in the eastern parts of Ukraine, because from a geopolitical point of view, this would have, and I will go to the second and the third dimension to explain how I actually anticipated the whole process. In reality, this would have meant a second invasion of Ukraine following the 2014 episode, where in fact Russia annexed parts of Ukraine. This was Crimea, and also established military presence in other parts of Ukraine, which was in the eastern part of Lugansk and Donetsk. And these republics were basically directly backed by Russia's military support, equipment, and financial backing and whatsoever. And of course, the aspirations this time were going beyond the republics, namely reaching to the so-called regions, which in fact in December were still two-thirds of these regions were still under Ukraine's control. And this, of course, would have meant casus belli, because, given the fact that military attack was definitely on the agenda, Russian troops would have then entered these regions. And in reality, Ukraine would have had only two options: either to send the Ukrainian troops against the Russian troops, and that this, of course, would have meant a direct military conflict, a war, or to withdraw them from the regions and basically to give Russia the opportunity to establish military control, to then either conduct a referendum, as it did in 2014 with Crimea, and then to decide either to declare them as independent republics, as it did with Georgia in 2028, or even to annex them, as it did in 2014. So you see different options, and still, given this scenario, I argue that from a geopolitical point of view, the West, and specifically the European powers, would have never remained on the same page, given their approach and response to the Russian actions, because once again, European powers would have been involved in a kind of dispute, how severe, how serious this response should be. Right? But in reality, by going the bank, what Putin did, in my view, was basically to skip several phases, as I said, from the next 10 to 15 years, and to really make a full-scale move on Ukraine. Basically, what we observed on 24th of February was not a single military operation or a special military operation, as he announced on the television, but it was in reality a war being conducted in three specific directions: in the south, in the east, and in the north of the country, simultaneously. And in a sense, by going the bank, in fact, the Russian president miscalculated on the response by the European powers.
Right.
And of course, it miscalculated also significantly on the response by the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian resistance. So two of the main factors that he actually was counting on did not come true. Right, so Ukraine sustained a blitz operation. I will be right. I just need a few more sentences to explain. So Ukraine, in fact, sustained the blitz operation in the first few days. A huge miscalculation by the Russian president. As second, the European powers were already prepared for a worst-case scenario, and in fact responded swiftly and with the most severe sanctions ever in the history of the relations between the European Union and Russia. Where he did not miscalculate, once again, was the reaction, China's reaction. But this, of course, is a question mark. Now, let me just clarify something. This is now the tactical level. This is the first and most important dimension. What was the long-term plan of doing this? Why did he go the bank? This is, of course, a question we need to understand. And in fact, what he seeks to do is something that goes much beyond Ukraine itself. He needs Ukraine. So basically, the necessary condition for his revisionist ambitions is Ukraine. But this is not the sufficient condition. The sufficient condition would be to be successful with this war and to actually build something that goes back to the imperial Russia, to create a union of the three main countries that actually represent the Russian, the one and the same people, right? Which he he pointed out several times in his written essays, to unite Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus into something that he may call union state or whatsoever state, and then to also annex other parts from other Eastern European countries, such as Transnistria in Moldova, the republics in Georgia. So he has also more space, and by having more space, basically he is suddenly in charge of the largest European country. So he basically is then able to rewrite the rules of the European security architecture. And this is the second dimension. And the third dimension, of course, preparation for the long game, namely, he needs more space, he needs his own sphere of influence, he needs his own grandiose geopolitical project in order to position himself in the competition between China and the United States.
So one of the biggest fears most people have right now is that this is going to evolve into a world war, and other countries get sucked into this conflict. And what would you put the percentage at today, and what are some of the key factors to look at how that could escalate into something even more all-encompassing of countries all around the world?
If we look at the period between the First and the Second World War as an intermission, so is, in my view, the period between the First and the Second Cold War. This intermission is over. We should actually accept the fact that we are already in a Cold War II situation. Whether we like it or not, whether we see clear signs of it or not. Evidence, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So in a sense, I argue that we are already in a situation, it's a transitional period of the international relations. We are at an inflection point in the global affairs. And I argue that Russia's war marks the manifestation of Cold War II.
What are some possible tipping points that would cause escalate things dramatically? Have you itemized any of those type of things?
Yes, of course, I thought about it a lot. And for me personally, of course, the very fact that we are now observing regional players, because Russia, of course, is a significant great power with regional power projection. Russia's power projection is insofar regionally oriented because it goes, it follows a north-south vertical expansion of geoeconomic and geopolitical interests. Moving from the north, from the Arctic and the Baltic Sea, entailing parts of Eurasia and Central Asia, South Caucasus, Eastern Europe. So moving along the eastern flank of NATO, and then, of course, reaching to Black Sea, to the Caspian Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, and then you, meanwhile, are also observing on a map military bases and presence in the Middle East. And this, of course, vertical expansion is now moving even to Africa, with the possibility also to get an access to the Indian Ocean. Now, given this regional power projection, of course, the very fact that we have significant state actors which are still willing and able to use hard power in order to solve political problems, and this, to my mind, is not going to be the only case. On the opposite, this will actually open a Pandora box. So this is one tipping point for me. I mean, Russia's full-scale war is definitely a tipping point, in a sense that so far there have been limited military operations and limited military conflicts and tensions in this, intermission between the Cold War I and Cold War II. But right now, we are observing full-scale wars where countries withdraw basically the map, and by doing so, in fact, they are denying the very existence of other sovereign countries. And of course, we can argue that we have witnessed many other wars in this period. But we haven't observed that kind of blatant rewriting of the global map.
Right.
When it comes to the existence of countries, even the U.S. wars, they did not deny the existence of the sovereignty of a country, ABC.
Right.
In the Balkan wars in Europe in the 90s, they did not deny the existence of the countries ABC on the map, on the opposite, right? So in a sense, this is a new element. This will actually open the door to other revisionist powers to put their demands on the agenda and to actually use hard power in order to achieve political goals. This is the one thing. And the second is that we have to look at the non-military dimensions of the Cold War. So you look at the political economy domain, and you see already that there are commodity wars being prepared. Because I argue that the Russian president has indeed factored in the severe sanctions and has in fact prepared retaliation by being one of the most significant commodities exporter in the world. Even if he decides to ban exports, like take, for instance, grain exports or other significant commodities, not just in the field of energy, he knows that he will unleash centrifugal forces. There will be a food crisis, which has already begun emerging last December, where the food price index reached Arab Spring levels. And now by doing so, by launching grain export bans, he knows very well that this will in fact accelerate the processes. So you have commodity wars. This is definitely a tipping point where there will be no return, because it will actually lead to unanticipated second order events. We don't know exactly how, but take North Africa, Middle East, Asian countries, which are so dependent on these grain exports. And it's a recipe for political, economic, and social turmoil. And this, of course, by unanticipated second order events, I of course mean coups, I mean military conflicts between neighboring countries, migration flows, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, we are there. And of course, the other tipping point, which has been in the making since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in fact, we have been prior to that already in a deglobalization cycle since 2013, but with the COVID pandemic, we also entered a global disruption of supply chains. And I argue that given this war and this bifurcation where China will side with Russia, because otherwise it will even get more weaker due to the decoupling efforts on both sides, on the side of Washington and on the side of Beijing. So they cannot stop these processes right now. So China needs to support Russia, because otherwise it will actually suffer from these processes. In a sense, I argue that this next very important tipping point will be the split, if you like, or the coexistence of alternative supply chains, because on the one side, China will need to create alternative sea lines, terrestrial connectivity, one that is not under American control. And by doing so, it will also have to reconfigure supply chains. And then on the other side, of course, the West is doing the same, has been doing the same since the last 2 years. So you are observing also bifurcation of the supply chains.
There's a lot there that I'd like to follow up on. I want to talk about projecting hard power, specifically in the context of a potential invasion of Taiwan by China, and then also looking at the dynamics of a second Cold War. But for right now, I wanted to follow up on this idea of a commodities dimension to the unfolding conflicts. And many have pointed out that there are these massive exceptions in the sanctions package for Russian energy exports, because Europe is so desperately reliant on their liquid natural gas and their oil. And it's hard not to reflect on the past decade or so of pushes by environmentalist governments to stop the development of fossil fuels and nuclear energy, and the fact that that has now put them in this precarious spot. So how do you think about the energy economics dimension of all of this? And what, I suppose, recommendations do you have going forward?
Well, first we need to understand that a lot of these decisions are, of course, being taken by politicians, decision makers who operate in 2 to 4 years time frame. And in a sense, they do not take the responsibility for, their decisions or, for the long-term repercussions of their decisions. This is the first thing. And of course, the decision on decarbonization, which has been taken here in Europe collectively, because more or less it's a decision which emerged out of a very complex twofold process, a decision-making process. We have on the one side European Union institutions, and on the other side we have the governments. And this decision is not irreversible. In a sense, all governments stick to it, but it's highly political and has no real geoeconomic understanding that backs it. It's political in a sense that right now, of course, many governments have also a Greens party as part of the government. Either at local or at federal level. That's the first thing. Second, because there is a lot of pressure coming from the society, so they need to do it. And third, there is a political promise that is not backed by the reality. And the reality is that right now, I don't see how they are going to cut the dependence on fossil fuels in general in the given time frame.
Right.
First, when it comes to dependence, because you named it, in reality, right now, there is a serious discussion in European capitals as to how quickly and how swiftly governments should cut the dependence on specifically Russian gas, which is around 40%. And of course, oil. Now, given the fact that there are European Union members which are dependent on Russian gas between 80 and 100%, it is obvious that these decisions are not realistic at all, because if there is a collective decision, exactly these countries will be so hard hit that the others in the family of the European Union will have to take care of their energy security as well, which of course is unrealistic as well. And in a sense, it is a kind of a more or less suicidal position. Now, of course, the logical question will be, why did these countries not take the necessary steps to actually cut these dependencies?
It's like they're playing one-dimensional chess instead of four-dimensional chess.
And the truth, exactly. And the truth is that there was no real incentive, neither on the side of governments nor on the side of lobby groups, to actually cut these ties because of the cheap possibility of getting the Russian gas, not because there are no alternatives. So in reality, we are where we are. It will take much longer to cut these dependencies. Whether this will happen, I do not have any doubts. It will happen because energy has turned into a geopolitical tool. And in fact, the Russian government already threatened that they may, in fact, cut the supplies to Europe. Right now, we are in such an awkward situation. In fact, in the gas flows to Europe from Russia, in the first 10 days of the war, have increased. And in reality, Europe has been funding Russia's war against Ukraine, even though that European Union is in fact siding with Ukraine and is actually supporting Ukraine with financial funds, with defensive weapons and whatsoever. So you see how absurd the whole situation is. And I struggled throughout all of these years to actually explain to decision makers and to people in governmental positions how important it is to be diversified, because energy security, first and foremost, does not mean to get your energy from the from the cheapest source, but in fact is to be diversified to the extent that if you have to avoid one of your suppliers, you will still be actually safe in terms of supplies, because the rest of your suppliers will actually provide the necessary volume. And this is not the reality right now. This is not the reality in Europe. So when the United States decides to ban Russian oil, it is only because the United States is self-sufficient in terms of energy. The United States is no longer dependent on a sole source of energy. First and foremost, the United States have become also energy exporter. And this is a very different story when we compare it with the European Union, which is still very much dependent on energy supplies.
Absolutely. And China has come up several different times in this conversation, and I know that for a long time you've advocated for the Dragonbearer thesis, that there's this growing alliance fomenting between Russia and China, whereas a few decades ago it was seen as improbable that those two would ally in the way that they have. Now it's looking more and more like that is shaping up. So would you say that this, the fact that China has not only not formally condemned Russia, but that they actually might play a key part in helping them evade sanctions, provides evidence for your thesis? And how do you see that evolving going forward?
Well, I very much hope that I will be wrong on this thesis about the Dragonbearer, because if I am wrong, then it would mean that the two would not coordinate and will not create a second powerful geopolitical bloc that will be confronting the West in the next years, decades, or who knows how long it will take. So in a sense, my thesis about the Dragonbearer is now actually showing clearly what a modus vivendi of coordination between these two powers really means on the ground. Because I argued right from the start that this is not going to be an alliance. Both do not need to enter an alliance. There is no strategic necessity for an alliance or for intent or what kind of Western understanding we have about alliances based on shared values. There is one major shared interest, and that is to survive in this transitional period of the international relations. Specifically, this is, of course, meant for Russia, but for China, equally, it would mean, and this is, of course, the second shared interest, to create a credible counterweight to American global power projection. So in a sense, it's a kind of an unwritten agreement between these two powers to coordinate in all relevant strategic domains that will help them create a credible counterweight to American global power projection in relevant geographical areas as well, where they can actually come together, work closer together in order to drive away other external actors, and specifically, of course, it's about the West. And I can give you a concrete example. Such geographic area is the heartland. This is the Eurasia. They will need Eurasia to create terrestrial connectivity, north-south, and also west-east. North-south, it means, of course, given the climate change, if the Arctic offers new opportunities with the Northern Sea route, this would give both powers a maritime sea line. So basically, maritime line for transport of goods, and also, militarization of a maritime line away from American global dominance. On the other side, of course, the Eurasian heartland is what has been described by all geopolitical analysts as the heart of the axis or the key to global dominance. In a sense, if they come together, and the one being a former heartland superpower, namely Soviet Union, the successor of the Soviet Union, and now another one being en route to emerging heartland power, because China is not simply building up in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific and in South China Sea. China is simultaneously seeking to become both a rimland and heartland power. And China can become a heartland power only with the help of Russia. And at the same time, it can also focus on becoming a rimland in this specific Indo-Pacific realm. So in a sense, there is geographic overlapping. The thesis that they will have actually conflictual interests in specifically Central Asia, and also to some extent in South Asia, have not been validated so far. In reality, the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan last year, the military involvement of Russia in Kazakhstan in January this year show, in fact, coordination where, in reality, both are using this modus vivendi to fill a geopolitical void, to create certain stability for themselves, and once again, to help each other to prevent other external actors from entering these areas.
So there's a lot of people that are writing articles about how different the technology is between World War II and how it's evolved to today. And one of the big differences is that we have so much more awareness of the world around us. And people have cell phones that they can access and get the news. And so Russia really has a hard time controlling the media like they've done in the past, because people are downloading VPN apps on their phones, and they're actually getting the real story. So we're seeing massive protests in St. Petersburg and other Russian cities. And so I'm just curious as to how big of an effect this will have, because the stories that are coming out of the Ukraine are, there's one about farmers taking on a tank, and they took it over, and they showed a video of driving down the road with a tractor pulling the tank behind them. And these type of things are hugely motivating to this little ragtag force in the Ukraine that's trying to survive. So how big a factor is this? And is there protests inside of the Soviet Union that will ever amount to anything that they need to concern themselves about?
There are indeed protests, but I do not consider them as risky enough or dangerous enough to topple the Russian president. If there would be any real risk scenario for the Russian president at all, given the circumstances, so that means given how successful he will be with the war, given the repercussions from the sanctions, that means how precarious the situation will become in the country, and also, given the isolation of Russia. So these three specific factors, the only realistic risk scenario I see for him, that means who could topple him. I do not see a danger coming from the Russian people, and please consider that Russia still has actually mostly rural population. So you have the urban population in the big cities in Russia. Parts of it went to the streets, but many people are still dispersed in the largest country of the world, somewhere in the middle of nothing, where you are only watching Russia-controlled television, and people really buy what they see, right? So in a sense, we only get to one side of the picture, the current picture. So it's not going to be the Russian people, it's not going to be the oligarchs, even though that they are already feeling the pain by the sanctions. It's only going to come from the closest of the closest circles of Putin, which consists of the so-called Siloviki. These are the people from the intelligence services, from the military, from the security apparatus. And these people, if they see an imminent threat to Russia, and you have to also understand that there are people in these circles who, compared to Putin, are real hawks, who would not stop themselves from pushing the button and exterminating the whole world. Real hawks, like he looks, even Putin looks like liberal compared to them. So in a sense, or let's say a realistic danger for him would come from the Siloviki circles, depending on, as I said, on the way how these three factors will further develop in the next probably few weeks to months. So this will be the decisive period, which I will be carefully looking at, to see how to see the direction of this trends development.
So is there one hardship that would really influence the outcome? I mean, if we cut off all their vodka supply or something, is there one single hardship that they're so reliant on that that would change the course of events?
I think they make most of the vodka in Russia. I don't think they get it from
I think
here.
they do.
I don't think we
too,
can cut off their supply.
Yeah.
It is hard to tell for someone who has come from the Soviet bloc and has lived during this time and also survived the 90s. I really struggle to give you an answer to that. I mean, if I go back to the past, even during my childhood, I've seen everything. So in a sense, with what kind of scenario these people could be really scared of? Hyperinflation? Check. Default? Check. So basically, you have in a country where you have seen the worst, and you have seen the worst on a permanent base, right? From one worst to the next, from one worst to the next. Right now, if I compare Russia's main socioeconomic factors, even with the ones in 2014, following the previous isolation, I would say that he has carefully prepared in every significant domain for what would come next if he would attack Ukraine in financial terms, in social, so basically in socio-economic terms. And it's really hard to tell how what exactly the tipping point will be for the Russian state to collapse, to declare a default, whether China would really be open to this idea of Russia declaring default. This is a question that I cannot give an answer to.
Yeah, if a missile actually hit the Kremlin, or if a missile hit one of the nuclear power plants inside of Moscow, those are things that would have massive ripple effects.
Missile by whom? I mean, missile which was fired by whom? Yeah. I don't think that NATO, that the United States, first and foremost, and this is also part of the reading on the side of the Russian president, I think that he actually was expecting that there will be no strong role by the United States in terms of any military involvement. And here we see that there is no comparison between the U.S. role in Ukraine with the U.S. role in Taiwan. So it's a very different scenario for the United States specifically. These are two very different battles. And I think that this was also part of Putin's calculations that Biden would not allow any military involvement, which, as we are observing right now, 15 days into this war, is definitely the case. Yes, there is support coming from the United States, but I do not anticipate any military involvement by NATO member states, meaning not only America, but also the European NATO member states. So in a sense, if NATO would allow a NATO-Russia direct military conflict, this would actually support Putin's thesis, because right from the start, the Russian president was trying to define this as, NATO threatening Russia, and NATO basically trying to encircle Russia and coming to the Russian border. So in a sense, he tried to define it as a preventive military operation. And I don't think that NATO would allow this to happen, also because of the severe risks arising out of it. I mean, the possibility of a direct military confrontation is per 2022 unthinkable. And let's not forget that the Russian president stated several times throughout the last years that in the case of a nuclear threat, that he sees basically a world without Russia. He would not think twice, but would push the button. And this is something that we should be absolutely clear about. He would push the button on on Russia's nuclear weapons.
I wanted to follow up on something Thomas raised a couple of questions back, and that is the role of technology in this conflict. So the sanctions that have been leveled against Russia are unprecedented, both in terms of their severity and the speed with which they were passed. And they include things like freezing something on the order of 60% of the foreign-held reserves that are controlled by the central bank, and kicking the two largest Russian banks off of SWIFT. Do you think there's any possibility in Russian oligarchs or Russia proper using things like Bitcoin or blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies, to evade these sanctions? And just comment on that if you have any thoughts.
First, I think that there have been pre-planned and also coordinated actions by China and Russia in this particular domain, because on the very same day as Visa and MasterCard announced their decision. In fact, main Russian banks also announced that they will cooperate with the Chinese payment system. So in a sense, these things do not happen from one day to the next. You need preparation, technical preparation for these specific decisions, and it's it's a very complicated process. So I think that this also was indicative of preparations, and. So the one thing that will happen, of course, is that China and Russia will increase, of course, this coordination so that Russian banks can operate with China's help. And I've checked the list. There are already 80 members in this payment system. So you still have a lot of countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, outside of the West. We have 48 countries which actually introduced the sanctions, and the rest is still there. You have billions and billions of people who, in fact, have not been included in Visa and MasterCard payment systems, first and foremost. So in reality, there are many options. I think at least this is their calculations. I'm trying to, present some arguments why they probably think that they still have India, they have China, they have, as I said, a lot of countries in Africa, in Latin America that would be actually open to, operating with this Russian banks. And of course, crypto is a different chapter. Now, if I look at the Chinese efforts to, in fact, introduce digital yuan and to put cryptocurrencies under Chinese governmental control, I think that probably something similar will happen also in Russia, as they have been very very similar in the thinking, specifically when it comes to controlling the internet. I would not be surprised if at some point of time Russia decides to actually cut itself out of the internet and introduce its own internet. So basically, something that at some point of time even could reach to China, or China also introduces its own internet. And as I said, this would also be indicative of this bifurcation where you have basically two different systems operating or coexisting while not really having points of intersection with the other one. So this is the first. The second is that when it comes to crypto, as I said, I rather anticipate Chinese or Russian controlled digital currencies than leaving the population, leaving the choice at the level of oligarchs that would try to use crypto for for the sake of hedging and to basically save some of their assets. And once again, I think that specifically when it comes to technology, I've looked at the numbers. Russia has become already quite dependent on technological transfer in general from China. So in reality, sanctions, for instance, in this particular area will not really have a negative impact on Russia. Here we should also think about defense, space technology, satellites, telecommunications, as I said, internet, but also artificial intelligence, robotics, and so on and so forth. So all these relevant areas for the fourth industrial revolution. And when I said at the beginning that we are already in a Cold War II scenario, I started with the political economy, but I argue that technology is going to be another decisive domain, because China is already competing with the United States. And in this particular case, Russia sees itself as benefiting from Chinese tech transfer. So, for instance, Russian students are already going to China, to the tech universities or successful telecommunication companies. And we know, of course, that Russia still can rely on the excellence of its students, specifically in natural sciences or also in technologies. This would be the case. So this is also one example, one of many, where we already are observing a kind of coordination between the two states. And the other two important domains are going to be international standards and norms, where countries like China and Russia will be increasingly trying to become norms setters and not just norms takers. And once again, technology is going to be decisive, how they are going to introduce patents, how they are going to impose, for instance, if you talk about digital currency, are they going to introduce it also to other so-called partners, for instance, along the Belt and Road initiative or in the Eurasian Economic Union? And finally, of course, how are they going to forge alliances and partnerships with third countries? I think that, for instance, an example is how Russia is now using the Chinese card to forge new partnerships, trade deals, to enter trade deals. For instance, a fresh example is Pakistan. Basically, now, given the fact that China has built an economic corridor there, has built a lot of infrastructure, Russia is now entering Pakistan. The Pakistani market is going to build a pipeline for Pakistan, something unthinkable just 10 or 20 years ago. And this is only one of many examples.
Yeah, so one of the tools we use in the futurist world is a tool called backcasting, and so I'd like you to actually think about yourself sitting in the living room in the year 2032, 10 years in the future, and you're looking back at this period of time, and I'd like you to think through how does this conflict end, and then what are some of the long-term repercussions or implications of this war that's taking place right now?
So we are in the year 2032,
yeah.
Right?
Right.
And we look at the map, and what we see on the map, on the global map, is a world that would look, in my view, very Asian-centric. Now, the first thing that I would see is, of course, a map pointing to two Asian giants, which are in a direct and an indirect military and actually regional confrontation, that these countries being China and India. India, meanwhile, being fourth or third world economic power with significant geoeconomic clout in the Indian Ocean, with various regional cooperations in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan is still there, still fighting back and having solid alliances with the United States, but also with other Eastern Asian countries. And that means that meanwhile, we are looking at the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific, and there is a clear bifurcation of two geopolitical blocks centered around the United States and China. Even Russia is already in the Indian Ocean and is having military bases at the eastern littorals of Africa, maybe in Mozambique or in Madagascar. Some are also in the Red Sea, is meanwhile operating as a global mercenary of Chinese geoeconomic interests along the Chinese Belt and Road in Asia, Africa, and some parts of Europe, and also, of course, reaching even to Latin America. In every of these continents, we are looking at it, and I don't see almost anywhere a significant European role. Meanwhile, I see Europe as a geopolitical backyard of the global affairs, being geopolitically irrelevant because of the lack of hard power. Europe is not able to exercise hard power projection beyond the Mediterranean Sea, is dealing with significant migrational pressure in the southern neighborhood because of climate change and significant terrorist activities. The Sahel region has meanwhile become the hub of terrorist activities, and this of course creates a whole corridor which is blocking a lot of Africans from moving from the south towards the north. On the other side, of course, the north of Africa being already penetrated by several regional actors who have established their zones of influence. Now, looking at the United States is still this most significant global player, which is competing with China in every relevant domain, from space, where they have meanwhile separated space stations, and satellites are being constantly attacked, to the military domain, where there are, of course, proxy wars everywhere, where drones are operating, new technologies are being used. And of course, then moving to the political economy, we are meanwhile seeing a world in which there are basically parallel networks from economy and trade to agriculture and even regional organizations. You see clearly a bifurcated world of coexisting blocs, which have decided that a direct military confrontation would be more or less disastrous for both. So they decide to not engage in a direct military confrontation, but to coexist while confronting each other via proxy wars and also indirect participation in third parts of the world. And where is Russia? Russia is where it has been. Russia is meanwhile in this exact vertical axis of geopolitical and geoeconomic expansion, has swallowed some parts of Europe, has meanwhile managed to militarize the Arctic, and once again, as I said, is challenging on the one side Europe, which has shrunk, but on the other side is also operating increasingly in Central and South Asia. And I would stop here because otherwise I may start enjoying
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Process.
The next 10 years of the history of the world. Thank you so much.
It was just
thanks so much for shedding light on these difficult situations and the conflicts that are unfolding, and we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is quite enlightening. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, and I really hope that I will be wrong with most of what I have outlined for you in the last hour or even more, because, as I said, not much of it is really optimistic, but I've never strived for optimism. I only wanted to reflect on the world the way it is and not the way it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure.